There is something happening right now in the Middle East that the headlines will tell you is about missiles and drones, but if you stop at that layer of the story, you have missed everything that actually matters. Iran has launched ballistic missiles and kamikaze drones targeting US and Arab military bases across the region, and the world is watching what looks like a dramatic military escalation. But here is what I want you to understand before we go any deeper. Every single move on this board was anticipated by someone, and that someone was not sitting in Tehran. The real question, the one nobody in your primetime news cycle is asking, is who benefits from this moment, why now, and what invisible architecture of pressure, debt, and imperial decline made this moment not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. I will give you the full picture. And I will tell you right now that there is a critical realization buried in the middle of all this, something about the nature of American power in the Gulf, that I am going to unpack fully before this video ends. Stay with me. Let us start with what we actually know. Iran launched a coordinated wave of ballistic missiles and what military analysts are calling Shaheed-type kamikaze drones, slow, cheap, devastating in volume, aimed at US military installations and bases used by American allied Arab states in the region. The initial reports are framing this as an act of Iranian aggression, a rogue regime lashing out, the axis of resistance doing what it always does. That is the surface narrative. And it is not false, it is just dangerously incomplete. To understand why this matters, we have to look at the timeline of pressure that preceded this moment. Because Iran does not move like this without a sequence of events that pushed it here. This is not a country that acts randomly. The Iranian strategic culture, deeply rooted in Persian history, Shia theology, and centuries of dealing with foreign interference, operates on patience. They study the chessboard for months before they touch a piece. So when they move this dramatically with ballistic missiles that have a range capable of hitting multiple Gulf states simultaneously, combined with drone swarms designed to overwhelm air defense systems through sheer attrition, you have to ask what they were responding to and what calculation they made that this was the right moment to escalate openly. The calculation, I believe, involves three converging pressures. The first is internal. Iran's leadership faces a population that is exhausted, economically strangled by sanctions, watching their currency collapse, watching young people leave the country in waves. The regime needs a narrative of strength. It needs to demonstrate to its domestic audience that the Islamic Republic is not a paper tiger, that it can project force, that the sacrifices of decades of sanctions and isolation were not in vain. This is not unique to Iran. Every government under siege, financial, political, or military, eventually reaches for the tool of nationalist military display. It is a pattern as old as organized states. The second pressure is regional. The normalization wave, the Abraham Accords, the Saudi-Israeli back-channel negotiations, the gradual warming between Gulf Arab states and Tel Aviv represents an existential strategic threat to Iran's influence architecture. For decades, Iran has built its regional power not through conventional military dominance, but through what strategists call the axis of resistance. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthi forces in Yemen, militia networks in Iraq and Syria, and Hamas in Gaza. This entire architecture depends on the Arab street remaining sympathetic, or at least ambivalent, toward the Palestinian cause and hostile toward Israel. The moment Saudi Arabia and the UAE fully normalize with Israel and integrate into a US-backed regional security framework, Iran's entire proxy network loses its moral and political oxygen. So from Tehran's perspective, striking US and Arab bases is not just military signaling, it is a message to every Arab government that is flirting with Washington's vision of a new Middle East order. We are still here, and there is a cost to alignment with America. The third pressure is global, and this is where the story gets genuinely interesting. We are living through a period of accelerating dollar hegemony erosion, the BRICS expansion, the quiet but steady movement of commodity trade into non-dollar settlement, the Chinese brokered Saudi-Iran détente from 2023. These are not isolated events. They are pieces of a larger picture in which the unipolar moment that defined American foreign policy from 1991 onward is coming to a close, and the United States, rather than managing this transition with the grace of a mature empire, is doubling down. More troops in the Gulf, more carrier strike groups, more weapons to regional partners, more sanctions, more pressure. And here is the tragic irony of imperial decline. The harder you squeeze, the more you accelerate the very fragmentation you are trying to prevent. Now, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about this before you answer it in the comments. if American military presence in the Gulf is the primary security guarantor for Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and the other monarchies, and if that presence keeps getting targeted, keeps proving vulnerable, at what point does the security guarantee become a liability rather than an asset? Because that question is being asked right now in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, and the answer to it will reshape the entire energy architecture of the global economy. Let us talk about the drones for a moment, because the drone dimension of this attack tells us something that pure missile analysis misses. The Kamikaze drone, the Shahed 136 variant, and its Iranian-produced cousins, is perhaps the most geopolitically disruptive weapons technology of this decade. Not because it is sophisticated, quite the opposite. It is cheap, it is reproducible, it can be manufactured at scale with relatively modest industrial capacity. A single Kamikaze drone costs somewhere in the range of $20,000 to $50,000. A single Patriot missile interceptor costs $2 million. Do that math across a swarm of 100 drones, and you begin to understand why this technology is not just a military problem. It is an economic warfare problem. Iran, and by extension Russia, which has deployed nearly identical technology in Ukraine, has figured out how to force their adversaries to spend $2 million to stop a $20,000 threat. At scale, this is not a military equation. It is a financial attrition strategy, and America's partners in the Gulf are burning through Patriot interceptors at a rate that no defense budget has been built to sustain. But to understand why this matters even more deeply, we have to look at what these bases actually represent in the Gulf's political economy. The American military installations in Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, and the broader network of logistics hubs and pre-positioned equipment across the Arab Peninsula are not simply military assets. They are the physical manifestation of a protection racket, and I use that term not pejoratively, but analytically. These bases exist because the Arab monarchies need protection not just from Iran, but from their own populations, from regional rivals, and from the general instability that comes with governing vast oil wealth in societies with deep internal contradictions. In exchange for that protection, these governments recycle petrodollar revenues into US Treasury bonds, purchase American weapon systems at premium prices, and subordinate their foreign policy to Washington's strategic preferences. This is the architecture of dollar hegemony made physical. The bases are not just military, they are financial instruments. So when Iran targets those bases, it is not just attacking military hardware. It is attacking the credibility of the guarantee. It is saying to every Gulf monarch, America cannot protect you. And that message, amplified by every drone that gets through the air defenses, every missile crater photographed on an airfield, is read very carefully in Beijing, in Moscow, in Riyadh, and in every capital that is quietly weighing whether the American umbrella is still worth the price of admission. Here is another question I want to leave with you. At what point does a nation's military presence abroad shift from projecting strength to advertising vulnerability? Because there is a version of this story in which American bases in the Gulf are not deterrents, they are targets, and targets change the strategic calculus in ways that no defense secretary briefing will ever say out loud. Now, let me bring in the economic layer, because this conflict cannot be understood without it. Iran's economy has been under sanctions for over 4 decades, with the pressure intensifying dramatically since the United States withdrew from the JCPOA nuclear deal in 2018 under the Trump administration and reimposed maximum pressure sanctions. The theory behind sanctions, the same theory applied to Russia, to Venezuela, to Cuba, to North Korea, is that economic pain will produce political capitulation. The regime will crack, the population will revolt, the government will come to the table on Washington's terms. This theory has a perfect empirical record of failure. Not partial failure, complete, consistent, documented failure. Sanctions have never successfully changed the strategic behavior of a determined government with sufficient internal legitimacy or coercive capacity to survive the pain. What they do instead is harden nationalism, eliminate the moderate reformist voices within the targeted country, and push the sanctioned state into the arms of Washington's geopolitical rivals. This is not a controversial observation. It is the conclusion of serious strategic analysts across the political spectrum, and yet the policy persists. Why does a demonstrably failed policy persist? This is the critical realization I told you about at the beginning, and now I am going to unpack it fully. The persistence of failed policy in American foreign policy is not evidence of stupidity, it is evidence of captured decision-making. The sanctions regime, the weapons sales, the military deployments, these are not primarily strategic tools, they are economic products. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing Defense, General Dynamics, These companies do not profit from peace. They profit from tension, from threat inflation, from the permanent state of managed conflict that keeps procurement budgets growing and stock prices elevated. When Iran launches missiles and drones, the immediate market response, within hours, is a spike in defense contractor stocks. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is publicly observable market behavior. The architecture of American foreign policy has been captured by interests that are financially dependent on the continuation of threat, and that capture distorts every strategic decision, from the refusal to return to the nuclear deal, to the deployment of additional carrier groups, to the green-lighting of Israeli operations that guarantee regional escalation. This does not mean Iran is innocent. This does not mean the missiles are justified. It means that if you want to understand why this cycle of escalation never resolves, you have to follow the money, not the missiles. The missiles are the product. The money is the policy. Now let us zoom out to the global chessboard, because what is happening in the Gulf is connected to what is happening in Ukraine, in Taiwan, in West Africa, and in the quiet corridors of the IMF and World Bank, where the future architecture of global finance is being negotiated. We are in a period of profound systemic transition. The Bretton Woods Order, the post-World War II framework of dollar hegemony, American military supremacy, and Western-dominated international institutions, is under structural stress from multiple directions simultaneously. China's rise as an industrial and technological superpower has fundamentally altered the global balance of productive capacity. Russia's survival under sanctions, its economy growing despite the most comprehensive financial warfare ever deployed against a major state, has demonstrated that the dollar weapon has limits. The Global South's collective exhaustion with a system that consistently extracts wealth upward and northward has created a political opening for alternative frameworks that would have been unimaginable 15 years ago. Iran's strike needs to be read within this context. Tehran knows it cannot defeat the United States in a conventional military exchange. It is not trying to. What it is doing, what Russia is doing in Ukraine, what China is doing in the South China Sea, what the Houthis have been doing in the Red Sea, is testing the thresholds of American response, probing for the point at which Washington's commitments outrun its capabilities and its political will. Every drone that forces a Patriot intercept is a data point. Every base attack that draws a tepid U.S. response is evidence that the commitment is hollow. Every moment that America signals restraint rather than decisive response is read in Beijing as a preview of what Taiwan might look like. Does that mean war is inevitable? I do not think so. And here is why. The financial constraints on American imperial activism are becoming prohibitive in ways that no amount of political will can overcome. The United States is carrying a national debt that has crossed $35 trillion. The interest payments on that debt are now the single largest line item in the federal budget, larger than defense, larger than Social Security in net new spending. This is not a partisan political point, it is arithmetic. And arithmetic, as the saying goes, does not negotiate. The ability to sustain simultaneously a European theater commitment, a Pacific theater buildup, and a Middle Eastern military presence, while also managing the domestic fiscal pressures of an aging population and decaying infrastructure, is simply beyond the financial capacity of even the most powerful state in human history. Something will give. The question is not whether American commitments will contract. They will. The question is whether that contraction will be managed strategically or whether it will happen chaotically through a crisis that forces a sudden and disorderly retreat. I want to ask you one more question, and this one I think deserves real thought from everyone watching. If American military retrenchment from the Middle East is ultimately inevitable, not as a policy choice but as a fiscal and strategic reality, who fills that vacuum? And what does that mean for the global oil market, for the petrodollar, and for the everyday American who has no idea that the price of gasoline at their local station is partially a function of military deployments 6,000 miles away? Because that connection between the guns and the gas prices, between the bases and the bond markets, between the drones over Qatar and the dollar in your wallet, is the connection that almost nobody in mainstream media will ever draw clearly for you. And it is precisely that connection that makes this moment not just a foreign policy story, but a story about the financial foundations of American life. Iran's missiles did not just hit concrete and steel, they hit a narrative. The narrative that the American security umbrella is reliable, durable, and worth the geopolitical price that Arab governments and Asian allies pay for it. Every crack in that narrative, Every successful strike, every intercepted drone that nevertheless demonstrates the vulnerability of defended positions, is a signal to the global community that the unipolar order is in its terminal phase, not collapsing overnight, not ending in a single dramatic moment, but receding the way all empires recede, gradually, then suddenly, and always with leaders who insist, right up until the moment of inflection, that the system is fundamentally sound. What you are watching in the skies over the Arabian Peninsula is not simply a regional military conflict, it is one of the most visible symptoms of a global order in transition. The old architecture is cracking, the new architecture is not yet built, and in that interregnum, in that dangerous space between the world that was and the world that is coming, the risk of catastrophic miscalculation by any one of the major players is real and significant. The most important thing you can do right now is resist the temptation to see this through the lens of good guys and bad guys, through the lens of the narrative that was handed to you by people who have a financial interest in your outrage and your fear. Look at the structures, follow the money, ask who benefits. Ask what this moment means, not just for next week's news cycle, but for the decade-long repositioning of global power that is already well underway. That is where the real story lives, and that is the story that nobody in a position of institutional power wants you to fully understand.